I was born in Romania. I was born in the late 40s. I'm a post-war child. But when I say that I was born in Romania, it's a very complicated geography that I was born into, because my parents were from a city that was Romania, but when I was born was Soviet Union. So they had left right after the war from a city that was originally called Chernovitz, then it was called Cernăuți in Romanian, and Chernovtsi in the Soviet Union, and now it's Chernivtsi in Ukraine. And that's really the world that I consider that I came from, but I really never saw that place until the late 1990s. So I grew up in a small community of Jews from Chernovitz, and I went to a German language school in Bucharest. Romanian was really my second language. And then I left there with my parents in the early 1960s, ostensibly to go to Israel, but we actually stayed in Vienna for a year, and then I came to the United States in the early 60s with my family. So it's a kind of double, triple emigration, really, because the first preceded my birth, then a year in Austria, which was very familiar to me because German was my language, and my parents had always recalled that Vienna for them was, you know, the place where they should have grown up, strangely. And then the United States, where I came as a teenager, as a very young teenager, to adjust to a world that was really very foreign, and I didn't speak English, really. I didn't even want to learn English because I didn't want to go to the United States. And then that really became my home, my intellectual home, my academic home, and my language. So that's the story of my background. And I think that background has very much influenced my work also, from the very beginning, and in different ways. So as a multilingual child in the United States, I was kind of unusual, because most immigrants in the United States were very much encouraged, especially in the 50s and 60s, very much encouraged to acclimate very fast to English and to American ways of life. And I grew up in a family that was, or especially with a mother who was very resistant to that kind of acculturation and wanted to hold on to all things European, to her language, to her background. And for her, Europe was the point of reference. So I was a multilingual child, and in an education system that didn't really encourage that. So already in high school, I began to take courses at the university, which was Brown University. And then I enrolled there as a student, and I immediately, in literature, was propelled into very high-level classes, mainly because of my language abilities. So I immediately went into the field that many immigrants and exiles go into, which is comparative literature. We were made for each other, and a lot of my professors were immigrants from Europe, and the people who shaped the field in the United States were immigrants from Europe. It was very much my world. And so I was trained in college and then also in graduate school in comparative literature, and I looked at using my languages. I did a kind of classic dissertation with 3 writers from 3 different languages, looking at something that was actually very autobiographical, because I was looking at 3 writers who looked at the conflict of different cultures in their work. So my writers were Henry James, you know, Europe, America, Michel Butor, was constantly, many different kind of cross-cultural novels, and Uwe Johnson, who was, looking at East and West Germany, and also in his later novel, Germany and the US. So I was very interested in what kinds of novelistic or fictional or literary techniques that would result in, because I was interested in experimental fiction, really, and fictional experiments. The new novel was kind of the thing I most passionately studied in college and in graduate school. So my training is very firmly in comparative literature, and I came out of that field at a moment when there was a job crisis in the US, and there were no jobs in comparative literature at all. The jobs were in national literature departments. I mean, that's still the case pretty much. So I got a job in a French department, and I became a French language teacher and a professor of French, and comparative literature as always. And now I'm in an English department, but it's still, my field is still comparative literature. Almost immediately when I got my first job, which was at Dartmouth College, which was a traditionally all-male school and had just begun to admit women when I came and had just begun to hire women faculty, our work there was to re-envision that institution. And that work, which was institutional work, immediately also began to color and to shape my academic work. So we began in collaborative fashion, really, to study women's writing and to try to figure out what's the difference between women's writing and men's writing. Is there a difference? And I began to work very much in psychoanalytic theory, psychoanalysis, because that seemed like the way to begin to think about those questions of gender. And in a group of 7 women in my department, we edited a special issue of a journal together, Yale French Studies, which came out in 1981, and it was called Feminist Readings, French Texts, American Context. So it was bringing together French feminist theory and American feminist theory around certain questions, and it was an edited work. Some of the people who were represented in that journal became some of the major figures in feminist theory in the 1980s. So that's really the beginnings of my academic work, sort of post-dissertation, were very much in feminism. And for anybody who's interested in feminism, the family is a really important structure, and that's why psychoanalysis became important to me, because it's the place that we learn our gender roles, and it's the place where women in traditional family structures are subjugated. And if we want to liberate ourselves, but also our ways of thinking, I think we have to open up the structures of family. So that, for feminist thinking, family is crucial. For memory, family is very important because, of course, memory is passed down in part through family, but also through other institutions, schools, and more public institutions as well. I think in the 80s, family became a very important structure to think about larger historical forces through several factors. One had to do with the Reagan years and family values, which were a way to enforce a really conservative politics. So family values were something that any kind of progressive intellectual had to try to undo, attack, analyze, loosen. And so, but it also has to do with an opposite force, I think, in the United States, which was multiculturalism, the importance of multiculturalism and of the politics of identity, which also were very firmly tied to family. So I think to try to understand the structures of family and how how these are not private structures, really, but they're very much public political structures. The family is not a private institution, but it's really a historical social institution that enforces social and political values. That became very much the work of feminists and progressive intellectuals in the 1980s. At the very same time that we were also, that deconstruction and post-structuralism were very important forces, and that the study of memory came in, which was also kind of related to family. So family became a nexus through which to think through much larger questions than private ones. So I was working on that book, the mother-daughter plot, through a good part of the 80s. The 1980s, which was also the moment in the United States when feminist literary criticism and feminist theory, psychoanalytic theory, but also Marxist feminism really were at their peak. But also it was a moment when there were a lot of conflicts in feminist scholarship, and having to do with other categories of social difference and other identity categories, race and class, sexuality, and how those intersect with gender. So my work became very much involved in what I think led me to the study of memory, which is, what are the stories that are left out? What are the stories that are not told? Who has the authorities to speak and to tell? Whose histories matter and whose histories don't matter? That led me to photography, because I started thinking about, well, how do families tell stories about themselves? Family photographs seemed like a very important a medium or a very important genre through which family stories are told. Not just single photographs, but albums. And I began to look at those, not so much the way a sociologist would, like go into people's attics or go into people's houses and say, show me your albums and show me how you tell that story, but how those appear in literature, in memoirs, in the work of conceptual artists who reframe them to show how the genre and the medium actually works. But really, the looking at photographs and the stories that photographs told led me to the question of memory, because when you take a photograph, and especially a family photograph, it's really about trying to capture a moment and to save it, and it's for the future, and it's for the memory of the family. So then I also thought, when I was looking at the genre of the family photograph, that it's a vernacular genre of photography, and it's not very interesting as a genre, because the medium itself is very repetitive, it's very conventional, and your photographs and mine look pretty much probably exactly the same. So what makes this little piece of paper, square piece of paper, sometimes with little edges, so powerful? I thought the best way to do that is to look at my own, because yours don't mean that much to me, but mine mean a lot to me. And so I started doing some personal writing, and I realized that the albums that my family had migrated in so many different times, and they were like the albums of many people in my community, albums of loss, people who never made it, people who were killed. And it led me to think about the relationship of the genre of family photography to loss. And that really is what then led me to work on the Holocaust for the very first time. And I have to say that, having grown up in a family of survivors, and I should specify that my parents were not deported to any camps, and actually most of my family survived the war in this Romanian Cernăuți through very particular circumstances that I was to study a little bit later. But they were people whose lives were profoundly impacted by the Nazi genocide. They wore the yellow star, they were in a ghetto. My parents were actually married in a ghetto. I grew up with many of their stories. And realizing that, I also realized the Holocaust was something I really never wanted to think about or look at. I certainly did not want to look at any photographs. I didn't want to see any of the films. Once, by chance, without any preparation, I saw Alain René's Nuit et Brouillard, Night and Fog, and it devastated me for a very, very long time, and I decided I was never going to watch any of these things again. And then, just as I was working on this book on family photographs and on loss, and beginning to think about my own family's history, something I'd also never been interested in, several important works came out, just all at the very same time in the mid-1980s. One of them was Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, the other one was Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and the third one was Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. And it's a cluster of works that became very, very important to me because they really spoke to this conjunction of family stories, of narratives of loss, and of images of loss. And maybe one of the most formative moments for me in terms of shaping my work was watching Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, which I had decided I would only see a few minutes of, because it was very important, and I knew it was important, but I sat right next to the door because I knew I couldn't see films about the Holocaust. And I got completely caught up in that film and his curiosity to find out and his drive to unearth a story that was a very, very difficult story to tell. And that film became very important. But the film had a major problem for me as a feminist, which was that there are no women in it. And I ended up spending quite a bit of time with that film, in collaboration with Leo Spitzer, who's my husband, who's a historian, trying to figure out the gender dimensions of that film. And it was the first, my first real work in memory studies and Holocaust and studying the Holocaust. And the idea of that article was not to critique Lanzmann or the film for a major flaw. It was to try to figure out how such a powerful story about the Holocaust, which I think is still one of the major classic texts that you really can't do without, why that film would have such 9.5 hours of that film would have such difficulty looking at the faces of women while telling the story of massive death and destruction. And it was really just to try to figure out how the film worked and why that was an issue. And really, Shoah was actually a very important event in the United States, in the community of survivors in the United States, because after it was shown in cinemas and really in art cinemas, very difficult film to show, 5 hours and 4.5 hours, people don't usually experience movies that way. It was shown on television, and that made it very, very broadly available. And suddenly, people in the older generation wanted to talk, and they wanted to tell their stories. So I remember going with my husband Leo to a family Thanksgiving dinner, and his family, who had been deported to various camps and had survived, pulled us into a corner and just started telling stories that they had never told us before. And that then, we were handed these stories, and we didn't quite know what we would do with them. Suddenly it became this real sense of responsibility. And I realized that there's a multiplicity of those stories, and we in the second generation were kind of the recipients of these, and what were we going to do with them? So I do feel that my own history of immigration and multilingualism inflects the way that I have worked on memory, because I think it's made me open to the foreignness of those stories, to ways that memories can clash, and to the incomprehensibility or the untranslatabilities of certain stories, the ways that they're not easily accessible. When you grow up as a child in a multilingual community of people who've lived through many different things, you're used to hearing things that you don't understand. And sometimes you have to let those things stand, and sometimes you really have to find out more. So I guess that's how I would explain how my own background has inflected this work. Now, I also would like to emphasize the importance of feminism and feminist theory to this work on memory. And what happened, I found, in my work is that suddenly, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, some of the very same colleagues that I met at feminist conferences began to turn their work, just like I did, from feminism and just a more strict attention to gender to the study of memory. And I feel that there's a real continuity for all of us between those concerns. And I think it has to do with responsibility to others. It has to do with a real sense that academic work is political, and that it has a political import, and that it has to have an effect in the world. It has to do with the fact that the personal is political, which is an old, feminist slogan, but it's also very true for memory, that our own work and how we're the kinds of investments that we have in our work are important, It has to do with looking at, why am I interested in this and why is this important to me? So really, I guess it's important to say that I'm not a historian. And that's why I'm so happy to collaborate with a historian. I've now collaborated with a historian for about 20 years in my work, because I've always understood the importance of history, but I'm much more interested in cultural representations in art, in literature, in the ways history comes down to us through media, through objects, through artwork, through performances. And so that's really what I've been interested in. So for me, the important moments are the moments that open up memory and history. And that's why I began to think about history by thinking about memory. I began to be interested in history when I started to think about history as a narrative genre, as a way people tell stories about the past rather than some kind of objective or scientific kind of work. Now, I realize, of course, the importance of archival research and the importance of archives and objects that come down from the past and how we talk about them. But I'm interested in how those stories are told. So I'm interested in testimonies and how people tell the stories about the past. And I'm not suspicious of oral histories and oral memories and the forgetting and the mistakes that come into that, because I think that's just part of that. And I think that really is, it is really in the moment of the 80s that opened up. In the United States, we talk about studies a lot. That's also a phenomenon that sort of came up in the 80s and 90s. Everything is a studies. We now have disability studies, and we have memory studies, and we have Holocaust studies. I guess it's a way to think about the interdisciplinarity in different ways. One of the things that was so immediately attractive, I think, to feminist scholars about memory studies is, on the one hand, I talked about the responsibility to groups whose stories haven't been told, but the other is a really fruitful site in which to practice interdisciplinary scholarship. There's really no way to think about memory from one disciplinary perspective. If you think about it from the perspective of literature, you're missing a lot because you need history. There's no way to not have history. There's no way not to think about psychology or psychoanalysis. When you're start thinking about it, as I did through literature, think, well, what about institutions like museums? They're the sites of memory. What about the arts? It's not just in literature. Suddenly, all these novels that are about memory have photographs in them. Sebald, why? Mouse, it's comics. You have to think about the visual. It's a narrative, but it's visual. And that conjunction, anthropology, sociology, all of these come together, now neuroscience. And it's, one of the great things about being an academic is that you can learn new things all the time. And the study of memory became a place where people from many different disciplines could come together, often not happily. Historians were always very suspicious, and historians would come to the conferences and, have their own idea about memory and be a little bit suspicious about some of the cultural studies work and some of the literary and artistic analyses as standing in for history. They saw it as a little bit of competition. So I think the way to practice interdisciplinarity is to create these networks of people who think about the same question from different perspectives. And we're still struggling with that, because one of the things we have to struggle with is ways in which we don't understand each other. So we have discussions at different conferences where people come from different perspectives and don't actually speak about the same thing. And so there are frustrations in that interdisciplinary work, and there's a lot of work that you have to do to be able to work together across disciplines. But that's one of the attractive things about these formations. The other thing that happened, certainly around the study of the Holocaust, which also has to be multilingual and multidisciplinary. There's no way once you go into any archives, you find a number of different objects. You find letters, you find diaries, you find photographs, and you have to learn how to analyze those. So the work is already interdisciplinary. But the disciplinary formations that formed around some of the study of the Holocaust began to expand beyond the Holocaust itself to programs in Holocaust and genocide studies. So the kind of comparative, or I prefer to call it connective, dimensions of some of that work expanded beyond one history to other histories. I think that one of the things that happens that's been important to me about some of this work is the context in which thinking takes place. And that's, for me, the continuity also between feminist scholarship and memory scholarship, because it's often in workshops, in reading groups, in conferences where people come together, in edited volumes, that some of the more innovative work takes place rather than the kind of solitary scholar working in his study. I think it's now a given that we're no longer talking about memory in a specific national context, but that we're talking about memory on the move and memories across borders, or memory without borders, or transcultural, transnational memory. So the transnational term has to do with transnational conversations, but also with some of the effects of the painful histories of the 20th century and now the 21st century, which has to do with migration and diaspora. So memory is also diasporic. It gets carried from place to place by individuals, by groups, but it also travels through tropes, so certain tropes. So there's no absolutely not surprising that some of the very same architecture defines memorials and museums in different cultural sites because those tropes have been speaking to each other. And particular nations or groups that want to inscribe their histories into a transnational conversation will resort to those tropes and those terms in order to become part of the conversation. So there's also some worry about this transnational term, about losing the local. So the challenge then becomes about how to be anchored in the local, but then also travel across and have those local histories speak to each other. And I think there's definitely a challenge here that memory scholars are facing right now. What is the place of the study of the Holocaust within the transnational? Has it been too dominant in the study of memory? Certainly, I think, as I said before, some of the theoretical developments have been extremely powerful and important, and other scholars from other sites, other historical sites, have looked to the Holocaust in order to understand how trauma works and how transmission works. But often the focus on trauma has evacuated or maybe occluded other responses to the transmission of traumatic memories. If you begin to study memory across borders, really, you discover different paradigms that may not be trauma, that may be activism, that may be resistance in a grander way, that may be, as as South Africa has taught us, forgiveness and reconciliation. And I think some of these different responses might allow us to look back at the study of the Holocaust and find other kinds of paradigms. I think we've been, in the study of the Holocaust, we've been operating under a paradigm of unspeakability and untranslatability and incomprehension and aporia. And when you start sort of looking transnationally or transculturally, you find other paradigms. And I think that's been very important, but I think it's also made some people more suspicious of some of the paradigms that come out of Holocaust studies. Certainly a kind of exceptionalism. We suffered the most, the competitive aspects that can emerge not just from a way of writing, but from the focus on silence and on unspeakability that can lead to have us understand it as a kind of exceptionalism. And I think it's very important to look at the politics of certain terms and certain directions in the way that we've studied different histories and different memories. And I think that the focus on silence has occluded, first of all, witnesses' desire to speak and to tell their stories, and also different responses that may have to do with activism and resistance, not just in the generation of survivors, but in subsequent generations as well. And that suspicion of directions in Holocaust studies and the insistence on the transnational also have a risk to them, because I think that a lot of people feel there's been so much work in the study of the Holocaust that, well, that story's been told already. It's been told in a certain way. Let's turn to something else. Let's study something else now. But as we know, archives are still opening up, and many, many histories have not been studied. Local histories, small moments. People are finding documents in archives all the time now. So I think that it's important to not stop that work, to keep doing that work, but to keep doing it with an eye open to other ways to tell those stories. Post-memory. How did I think of this word? I think I already mentioned a little bit about the kind of personal connections that led me to my work, and really the idea of post-memory came out of reading Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Here he was, the son of survivors from Auschwitz, 2 survivors from Auschwitz, who did something really unbelievable. He drew the story of his family and of these survivors as a comic, and he did it as an animal fable. Jews are mice, and Germans are cats, and Poles are pigs, and Americans are dogs, and it was a really seemed like a very irreverent way to tell the story. But what I found so powerful about that story is something that I identified with completely, which was that he was trying to tell a story that had completely marked his life, but that was not his own story. He didn't remember it, but he was totally shaped by it. And I felt like he was doing something there that needed a term. And when I read the book, I read it very autobiographically, and I realized when I was reading it that I really shared his mental landscape, which had to do with the fact that I felt like I remembered some of the stories that my parents had told me about their youth, specifically about the war, more strongly than I remembered some of my own experiences as a child. They had a stronger, a more powerful place in my memory. And I felt like I needed a term through which to explain that. So I thought of this idea of post-memory. I was reading, there were so many posts at the time, postmodern, post-colonial, post-feminism already, post-everything, and it seemed like it was a kind of degraded notion of that. It had many different meanings, and I liked that. Some of the posts are positive, some are more negative, some of the posts mean after, but I very much like the notion that one of my colleagues recently, in a discussion of the post and the phenomenon of the post, she talked about it as one of like a yellow sticky that you stick on to your piece of paper, and when it's there, it changes what's on your text, but if it falls off, but it could also fall off. So the post is something that's very tenuous, that's very fragile, that's kind of related, but not an integral part of the thing. But it doesn't necessarily take over or redefine what's there before the post, the actual concept. And then I also read a really interesting article by a art historian, Andrea Liss, who was talking about Holocaust photographs and who was also using this idea of post-memories, which had to do with public photographs from the Holocaust and how they inflect memories. And that was also very inspiring for me, and somehow we came to the same idea around the very same time. Then, of course, the concept has evolved. More it has deepened. I tried to define it, how it works through examples. It wasn't really a concept that I wanted to impose on examples. I wanted to let it evolve from examples. So it became a way to think about a generational structure of memory and how memory is transmitted to the second generation, to subsequent generations. So it involved thinking about generations and why we think in generations. And it was a way to think about how memory is transmitted across time, but also in some ways across space for experiences that we might not ourselves have had, but that shape us and inflect who we are. I purposely didn't write a book on post-memory for a very long time. I developed the idea from the Mouse article and the last chapter of my book, Family Frames, which was on a number of literary texts and artworks that were second-generation works. And then I continued to write about it in a series of essays that had to do with different texts that have to do with the study of the memory of the Holocaust and how it returns in work by second-generation artists and writers. And those were then, I then shaped that into my book, The Generation of Post-Memory, but really it was work that happened through 15 years because what I wanted to do was let the concept speak to me and see how it works slowly. It really required thought, it required slow thinking. It was picked up very fast by other people, and that, in a sense, was helpful to me because I also felt like the dialogue and to see how other people use it was helpful to me in thinking about it. One thing that happens when you float a notion like this is that, the place you define it, the 3 sentences or the 3 lines in which you define it are the ones that people then write, use, and then they use it for their own purposes. And I wrote about it in many different places, but it was always those 3 lines that came back to me. And that was a little frustrating because the concept had already grown and developed beyond those 3 lines. And that's why I thought, putting some of those essays together into a book and reshaping them to make a book would give people a more, a fuller notion of how, how the concept has grown beyond that first definition. So that was really the only frustration. Otherwise, the way that it's been used has been helpful because I feel like I've been in dialogue with a lot of different people and that it's opened up, it's enabled people to work on issues that were important. It's opened the space for them to think about some of these questions of the transmission of memory across generations. When I first wrote about post-memory, I wanted to be very clear that it's not necessarily an identity structure, but it's a structure of transmission. So one image, for example, that was very important to me in Art Spiegelman is an image that I keep returning to, and it isn't really in Maus, it was in his first Maus in 1972. And there he draws a very famous photograph by Margaret Burke-White of survivors of Buchenwald, really, and his father was not in Buchenwald, his father was in Auschwitz. And it's that famous photograph where a number of survivors behind the barbed wire fence face the photographer. And Spiegelman draws that image, which is a public image, which was published in Life magazine in the 1950s, and he puts an arrow in the back of it on one of the mouse heads, and he says, "Papa." And then he puts little corner edges around the image and photo corners as though it were something that he's included. So an image that comes out of his own family album. And that really helped me to think about how subsequent generations receive histories that aren't their own. They receive them through family stories, through private communications, but they also receive them through many other media and documents, public photographs, history books, museums, memorials, other people's stories. It's a very multiple kind of transmission. So I wanted it to be very clear that post-memory is not an identity formation, that it's not reserved to those who actually, to specific family histories. So, and that doesn't give more authority to those people to speak whose families have lived through the Holocaust more than other people who may be in the same generation who have also received these histories very powerfully. For me, that was very important because I didn't want to create a kind of authenticity of experience for those, who own those histories and who are allowed to speak, and others who aren't allowed to speak. And so that was a way of, a bone of contention, because on the one hand I was critiqued for doing that when I wasn't doing that, because a lot of other people have done that. But on the other hand, people who were actually children of survivors said, you're taking our experience away. Our experience is different from our classmates who may also have heard those stories and may also have had some nightmares, but it's not the same as living in a family of survivors. So then for me, in the book, I tried to distinguish between what I call familial post-memory and affiliative post-memory. And the affiliative is really a structure of affiliation that could be identification, that could be solidarity, that could be a form of response or responsibility of others that we might have in a kind of generational structure where we affiliate with some of those memories, but not necessarily because they come from an actual inheritance. The way the study of memory has evolved was very much centered on the Holocaust for a long time, because so many people kind of flocked to be able to tell those stories, and the theoretical work was very powerful, very sophisticated, and so that people who study other histories have kind of turned to the Holocaust for some concepts, but those concepts are eminently exportable. And in fact, we have a kind of globalized memory culture now where some of the thinking that evolves in specific contexts are also exchangeable between those concepts. So in the United States, the study of the memory of slavery and the post-memories of slavery through generations was very helpful to me because, as I said, Toni Morrison's Beloved, to me, was the first big Holocaust novel that I've ever read. When I read it in 1987, when it first came out, I thought, there isn't such a novel about the Holocaust. But of course, it's more generations removed. Maybe there will be such a novel eventually. But when I read that, the way memories marked on the body, the way bodies survive, the way stories are locked up, as one of the characters in Beloved says, in a little tin inside his chest and won't come out. I mean, all of that spoke to me as a child of Holocaust survivors and as a student of the memory of the Holocaust. So I feel that these histories speak to each other. They're connected, and we can connect them. When I first started studying the memories of the dictatorships in Latin America or apartheid in South Africa, I saw that, you know, the ways that some of those memories were transmitted were actually not necessarily similar or comparable, but connected. And any of these histories should be studied necessarily in isolation. And I'm not one of those people who says, this is the worst crime. I mean, there's a whole sort of discussion now about competitive memories versus connective or multi-directional memories. And I think that's a very important discussion. And I feel that each of these histories has its own uniqueness, but that doesn't mean that they can't be studied in relation to each other. So for me, that's been a very important development in memory studies, that memory studies have come from many different directions and converge around certain questions and certain structures that we can illuminate from the perspective of a number of different histories and how they intersect.